Welcome to our 5 o'clock workshop. This is early returns from 4 far-flung field experiments. Our panelists today are Franz Meyer, Eric Hochberg, Lynn Russell, and Ian Fenty. And so right now we're going to get a short introduction from Tom Wagner from the Earth Sciences Division at NASA.
Hey, thanks. I'm one of the program scientists at headquarters that helps figure out what we're supposed to be doing. But we thought it was time for us to have a media workshop like this because we have these 4 fantastic new field programs that are just starting out that you may want to be covering in the next few years. And so this is a chance for you to ask them questions, get up to speed on what they're doing. They also really exemplify one of NASA's strengths, though, in having aircraft that can go to remote corners of the world and make these measurements that can improve our knowledge of the Earth as a system. One of the things people sometimes ask is that, hey, why is NASA doing field work at all? Why don't you guys just work with satellites? And the simple thing is, there's a natural synergy in the Earth sciences between aircraft campaigns and satellite work. A lot of times when we're developing instruments for satellites, we actually trial them on aircraft, and then we use those instruments later on to make more precise studies. Sometimes what our satellites see is at a coarser scale, and by going out and measuring things at a finer scale, we can see processes and other things occurring that we can then scale up and use with our satellite measurements to better understand the Earth system. One other thing that you should be aware of, though, is that these projects, a lot of them come out of what's called the Earth Ventures line. And in the last decadal survey, one of the things that was pointed, and the decadal survey is the National Academy study to figure out what NASA should be doing for the coming decade. And there was a town hall on it earlier in the week. One of the things that came out of the last one was say, hey, scientists needed more opportunities to get in the field, to develop instruments, to try things. And the idea for an Earth Ventures line for big field campaigns using aircraft was born. And without further ado, I'll turn over now to Franz Meyer, who's going to tell you about his project.
Okay, so this is an exciting new project within the Above campaign, which is a really interesting campaign that has been launched a couple of years ago to study the vulnerability of the Arctic to climate change. And we are one of many projects that was funded under this umbrella, and the project is looking into the emission of methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and we specifically are interested in the component that is emitted through lakes in the Arctic environment, so-called thermokarst lakes. And I know. And what we are doing is we are using remote sensing data like these, so imagery data, and combine it with fieldwork. So as Tom said earlier, the synergy, we're using the synergy of fieldwork and satellite images. So, and why this is interesting is because there's the permafrost in the Arctic is storing very large amounts of carbon, very old carbon that when permafrost is warming is starting to get released in the form of, partly in the form of methane. And one very good mechanism of releasing this methane is through bubbles that rise in thermokarst lakes. And so what you see here in this video is how much methane comes out of these lakes. So this is an ice cover on the lake. So you see the amount of gas that comes out and also the energy that is stored in that gas, which makes it such a powerful greenhouse gas. And so this is one of the parameters that we are studying. And we really want to know how much contribution do these lakes make to the methane budget of the atmosphere. And so we have known for a long time that there is a contribution to the overall methane budget, but we have not yet been able to really quantify how much that is. So our study is trying to combine remote sensing data and field work to sort of close this knowledge gap in our understanding of the contribution of thermokarst lakes. And so what really makes our work function is ice. So what we are doing is we're waiting for the lakes to freeze over in the winter. And as soon as the lakes are frozen, the methane bubbles that are rising through the lake column, they get trapped under the ice, as you see here, and the ice is freezing around them, and you get these very nice patterns and stacks of, of bubbles in the ice. And so the ice is really the key because it makes these bubbles accessible for us for analysis. We can analyze them now in the field, we can go out, we can probe the gas content of these bubbles, we can count them to quantify how much methane comes out of a lake in the field. And now that they are trapped in the ice, they're also visible in imagery. So we can use remote sensing data to now take quantifications that we've done on one lake and scale it up to the landscape scale. So for the first time, we're really able to analyze the contribution of these lakes on a large scale. And we've done a lot of field work and a lot of remote sensing analysis already in that study. And things that we found, first of all, is that there is a real good correlation between the methane that comes out of the lake, which is here, and some image parameters, some parameter of satellite images. So we can use satellite images to not only estimate the emissions from one lake, but to do it on a landscape scale. So give us these landscape scale estimates of emissions. And also what we found is that by analyzing remote sensing data over the last 60 years, we found that the recent warming in the Arctic had caused an expansion of these lakes. And we also found that in these expansion zones, this over here is an expansion zone, for instance. You see there are more of these holes in the ice. These are very strong methane emission places. So the methane coming out of these expansion zones is much higher than the methane in the old part of the lake. So what this indicates is there is potentially a positive feedback to climate change coming from these lakes. Another thing we did is we were able to link the methane coming out of the lakes to the actual carbon in the soil. This is a very important finding because it allows us to build this link between the soil that is now folded into the lake and the methane that gets emitted from it. So we can build that cycle of expansion and increase of methane. So we are doing field work, we continue to do field work, and mostly the goal of our field work is to make us better in estimating methane emissions. And so I showed you earlier that we already were able to establish this relationship between remote sensing data and methane emissions, but you also see that we have some gaps. This regression, this information is not perfect yet. So what we do right now is we go out in the field, we select lakes that allow us to fill in some of these gaps in these regression lines, and we do that iteratively. So every year we go out, select targeted lakes, and estimate their methane, so that at the end of the project we are in a much better position to get high-quality, large-scale estimates. So this year we went out to the greater Fairbanks North Star Barrow area, and so these are the lakes we analyzed this year. We've measured lots of parameters in the field. We measured methane emissions per lake in the field. We looked at the state of the permafrost around the lakes. We looked at the carbon nature of the carbon around the lakes to, again, build this feedback loop. And all the data we've collected is currently being processed. We're out in the field in October, and hopefully next time around we can give you more information. So in summary, our research is providing first regional scale estimates of lake-bound methane emissions and sort of their relationship to climate change. So we are at a stage where we can say something intelligent about how this contribution responds, how lake-emitted methane responds to climate change. There's some material that is being put out for you. There are some papers that I have available for you if you want more information. We also have some flyers for the above program and that are available to you also if you have more questions. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Eric Hochberg. I'm an associate scientist at Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. I'm the principal investigator of Coral, the Coral Reef Airborne Laboratory. The main partner with BIOS is JPL. Of course, it's from NASA. I won't belabor this. You've probably seen this throughout the press. The concern for coral reefs today is that reefs are going from this beautiful, lovely tourist paradise of high coral, lots of coral, and highly productive, to this sort of no coral, low productivity reefs for lots of apparent reasons, from local human impacts to global climate change. But the issue, again, is simply that coral is being lost, apparently. This is state-of-the-art reef assessment. A diver with a camera, really up close and personal, or sometimes being towed behind a boat. That is the state-of-the-art today. And that is how we assess reefs and figure out how much coral there is on a reef and how much may have been lost over time. These kinds of surveys give us some unexpected trends. So on this top graph over here, this is what's called aragonite saturation. This is the calcium carbonate in the seawater, and the higher the number, the easier it is for corals and other organisms to make their shells. And supposedly, one would presume that the higher the number, the more coral there would be. But the y-axis here, this up and down, this is higher coral, this is lower coral. The trend seems to be negative, that with lower aragonite saturation, there's higher coral. That doesn't jibe with what we sort of understand about reefs. And that's sort of a global scale kind of global climate thing. This is local marine pollution threat, and again, you have coral going from low to high, and low threat to high threat, and one would think that with more pollution there would be less coral, but the data don't bear that out, and that's very unexpected. So what's going on here? Do we know what we're talking about, or is there an issue? And I think the issue is that reefs are ecosystems, and they're tens of kilometers long by kilometers wide, and looking at them through a camera up close and personal doesn't give you an ecosystem scale perspective. This is one reef in Chuuk Atoll in Micronesia, and these are a whole bunch of reefs in the Great Barrier Reef, and you simply cannot survey those reefs simply by taking photographs a meter off the reef. There is too large an area, and that's the purpose of coral. The aim is to get a new perspective of reefs, the ecosystem scale perspective. This is to see the whole reef. The analogy is, of course, to see the forest for the trees, right? And we have 4 campaigns. We're going to survey. We have surveyed the Great Barrier Reef, sections along the Great Barrier Reef, where we will survey the main Hawaiian Islands, Mariana Islands, and islands in Palau. What we have done this year, we had what's called an Operations Readiness Test, ORT, that we did in Kaneohe Bay on the island of Oahu in Hawaii in June. That was just sort of a shakedown, dress rehearsal. This is the actual flight-aware map of our flights over the bay there. Then in September and October, we went to the Great Barrier Reef and did 6 sections up and down the reef from the Torres Strait in the north all the way down to almost near Brisbane in the south. And here is a flight track around sort of the northern central area of the Barrier Reef, center on Lizard Island. There's a research station there where we had a lot of in-water activities going on there. You can see these flight lines. These flight lines, this is where the airplane flew, translate into this kind of picture. So these are all of our airborne images overlaid on each other, and there are actually some underneath that don't show up. But this is sort of the scale that we're looking at. Not scuba diver scale, but ecosystem scale. Here's some preliminary results. We have just some reefs here, and the tidal range in the Great Barrier Reef, this area, is about 3 meters. It's about me plus a half. So there's a lot of water running through, and what we're getting is water rushing by these reefs and stirring up sediments. These are giant vortices of suspended calcium carbonate, suspended sand, 2 kilometers wide. In the south, on Heron Island, this is an up close and personal. This is from our validation data, our ground truthing, so to speak. Lots of live coral. This yellow box is the scale of one of the remote sensing pixels. It's about 8 meters across on a side. In the north, there have been tropical cyclones in warm water causing coral bleaching, and so they've ended up with a lot of dead coral up there. So the data, when they get processed, the airborne data, will reveal these sorts of differences, live coral and dead coral, which look like algae. Again, more sort of what we've done. This is the Pompeii sector of the Great Barrier Reef. So the reef area in here is about 140 square kilometers. This is vastly greater than could be surveyed by diving. These are 2 of those lines, these 2 outer lines, processed to show coral, algae, and sand, about 24 square kilometers. Couldn't be done diving. What's coming up in 2017? In February and March, we're going to the main Hawaiian Islands to get the whole coastline there. In April, we're going to the Mariana Islands. This is Guam. Down here, we'll do some field activities in southwest of Guam and Kaneohe again. And then in May, we're going to Palau. And this is almost to Indonesia, so we're getting quite a lot of reef area. And that is all about coral.
The NAMES, or North Atlantic Aerosols and Marine Ecosystems Study, is also looking at ecosystems, but we're trying to bridge scales from the smallest to the largest. So we include satellites, float, aircraft, and shipborne measurements to cross all those scales. This is an update on recent fieldwork this year. This project is proposed and has chief scientist Mike Barenfeld of Oregon State University, and I'm Lynn Russell. I work on the aerosol aspects at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So NAMES characterizes North Atlantic plankton populations over the annual cycle to understand how the spring bloom is recreated each year. So why is this new and controversial? Well, it turns out there is a textbook explanation that says the bloom in spring starts when the water warms up, sort of like flowers blooming, right? But it actually turns out that for years we've been able to see from satellite that the bloom, by which we mean the rate of increase of growth, actually starts the previous fall. And so the bloom initiation, we think, is actually starting before we start to warm up, and in fact before winter. And so with the combination of satellites and shipborne measurements, we're able to look at those different seasons and resolve those discrepancies. And that's important not only because the bloom regions represent a large amount of the Earth's productivity, carbon uptake, as well as production of phytoplankton for being eaten by fish and other things, but they also emit gases and produce substances that end up in aerosol particles in the atmosphere. And that's illustrated in this cartoon on the right, where phytoplankton produce dimethyl sulfide as well as dissolved organic matter that contribute to particle formation during photochemistry in the atmosphere, and after breaking waves help to release these substances from the surface waters, along with sea salt and other components. And so why is that important? Because the aerosol particles both themselves reflect sunlight and affect clouds in ways that reflect more sunlight than clouds with fewer particles. And so those impacts change climate. And so there's a feedback onto climate. And then those different conditions, we're also trying to predict how the bloom will change as warming waters create different conditions for phytoplankton blooms in the future. So NAMES involves 4 field campaigns targeting specific seasonal events and mobilizing ships, aircrafts, and autonomous platforms like the floats, as well as balloon soundings and satellites to allow us to see these many aspects of this complex problem. So this is Mike Barenfeld and 2 of our junior scientists at sea in late fall in November 2015, so about a year ago. We've had 2 cruises so far in the past 13 months. Each one is 26 days and follows the 40-degree west latitude line from approximately 55 north down to 40 degrees north. We've used for both cruises so far the NSF Woods Hole RV Atlantis, based out of Woods Hole, and then the NASA C-130 flying from St. John's, Newfoundland. And what has been the focus is up to 7 ship stations where the ship will stop and do detailed sampling of the water using CAS below, and then there will be aircraft flights syncing up with those sampling. So preliminary highlights are associated with the fall bloom initiation are shown here. First, it was some of the cleanest aerosol I've ever seen, except in the Arctic. Less than 40 particles per cubic centimeter, and interestingly, they were mostly associated with cloud active particles. And so that meant this is an image of where the clouds kind of fell apart, which we call open cells, and it coincides with where the air pollution got really clean. So showing that link in the clean marine atmosphere between what's in the atmosphere and what's coming out of the ocean, we can also do with chemistry, where we clearly see the impact of seawater concentrations in what we're measuring in the aerosol particles. And one of the highlights there was a really diverse plankton community already in its first stages of annual bloom, already in the fall. In the spring, the climax had a very unexpected bloom population and dramatic day-to-day changes in the plankton community at some of the mid-stations during our transect. There was extreme air-to-sea flux changes associated with high wind and a latitudinal dependence of the aerosol that isn't simply explained by chlorophyll, so it's clearly related with more complex phytoplankton community structure. And just to finish up, our plans are for 2 additional air-sea campaigns, the next in early fall, getting the pre-bloom initiation in September 2017, and then in early spring, the pre-climax stage of the bloom in March 2018. And these are some of our crews when they're not actually being thrown around the ship or plane during science.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for making time to listen to this discussion about the exciting work, field work that our colleagues and we are doing. The mission that I'm here to talk to you about is called Ocean Melting Greenland, and it's a very exciting mission that just started last year to understand the connection between a warming ocean and the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And this picture here was taken during the survey last summer to show up on a hillside the scale of one of our survey vessels and a fjord, and there in the distance an outlet glacier that drains the Greenland ice shelf. Everybody knows that the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctica are melting as our climate warms. Most people think that the melting of Greenland is happening at the surface because the atmosphere is warmer, but about half of the melting of the ice sheet takes place around the periphery in outlet glaciers where the ocean is in direct contact with, where the glaciers are in direct contact with the ocean. Now, the oceans absorb about 93% of the heat of global warming, so we're really interested in finding out how a warming ocean, especially around the ice sheet, will contribute to its melting in the future. And we need to know this, of course, in order to help improve projections of sea level rise. The OMG mission consists of 3 elements, 2 of which are repeated using NASA airborne assets, and the third one is a one-off survey. So the 2 that are repeated every year involve using an airborne radar to map the surface of the ice sheet, and airborne deployed probes, or sondes, ocean sondes, to measure the temperature and salinity of the ocean on the continental shelf around the island. And the one-off campaigns are the one-off campaigns involve mapping the seafloor around the ice sheet. The reason that that's important is because most of the warming of the ocean around Greenland and the North Atlantic in general is happening at depth, hundreds and hundreds of meters below the surface. The continental shelf is pretty shallow, so the only way that warmer water makes it across the continental shelf to the glaciers is in very, very deep channels. So we need to that crisscross the shelf. And just to show you an example of one, here's a big channel, another big channel, several large deep channels. So we need to map those channels very carefully and in fjords in order to be able to understand which glaciers are vulnerable to the subsurface warming. The 2 airborne campaigns collect data in the regions that are shown here on the figure to the right. The red lines represent 84 individual swaths that the radar flies to map the elevation of the ice sheet. And of course, the idea is we will repeat these lines every year to be able to quantify very carefully what the change in elevations of those glaciers are, especially near where they come in contact with the ocean. The yellow dots represent, each yellow dot is one of 250 sondes that we deploy from the aircraft. So you see the sondes are on the continental shelf. It's a little bit lighter color that indicates the shallower continental shelf. And they're strategically located in places where there is a high abundance of outlet glaciers that drain into the ocean. The first radar campaign took place this March, and the first deployment of the sondes from the aircraft took place in September and October. The picture on the bottom left is from the test flight that took place a little bit earlier, and it shows how our sonde is deployed from the rear of the aircraft, and a few moments later, you can see the parachute opening up so that the probe can carefully land to the seafloor. The seafloor mapping elements have been completed. They consisted of airborne measurement in the red polygons here in the southeast, northwest, and northeast sectors, and these black lines show the ship tracks of the ships that deployed sonar. And here's another photograph of one of the ships that we used in a remote fjord in southeast Greenland. This image shows kind of the scale of the ice surface elevation maps that we can create with the radar. And we chose this well-known glacier in West Greenland called Jakobshavn Isbrae. It's one of those glaciers that is changing the most that people have heard about. So the idea here is that we will track specific elements within on the ice sheet, and again compare from one year to the next what those changes are. Of course, all around the ice sheet. So this is something which is unprecedented at the resolutions and precisions that we can bring to bear on this problem. One of the interesting findings from this summer's sonde campaign, we've picked out here for you, and what it shows is ocean temperature in a remote fjord here in East Greenland. Now this is a fjord that isn't visited very often. There are few people live in that area or visit for any reason. So the last time this seawaters in that fjord were measured, as far as we can tell, was in the early 90s. And what I've shown here is a plot of the ocean temperature in 1990 in that fjord. Okay, the red line shows the temperature that we mapped with our sonde, and at almost all depths, especially in the deeper waters, we found the fjord is warmer by about a degree. And that's interesting because we know from other surveys further east in the Greenland Ocean that the waters there over that same time period have also warmed by about a degree. So this is good evidence that the warming waters further offshore are in fact making it to some of these more remote fjords that, and before now we only speculated about this. So that's very exciting. We've written up some of these results, described the mission in more detail in this month's Oceanography journal. There are also several other of our colleagues who have published with OMG data in that same issue. The next part of our campaign will be the repeat of the radar survey next March, and then of course the ocean sonde survey, which we will repeat in the late summer when there's the minimum of sea ice. Thank you.
Okay.
I guess we can just go.
Okay, so now we'll open up the floor to questions. Are there any questions from reporters in the room?
Hi, my question is for Eric. My name is Katrin Weiss. I'm from Earth Rocks. And there's a lot of questions I still have about coral. It seems to be it's visual only. The data that you're getting back is visual. But if you could just explain a little bit more about the data that you're gathering and what you're hoping, what you've seen so far from it, because I wasn't able to figure that out from what you were presenting.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure everyone will agree it's hard to distill everything into a few minutes. What we're trying to gather is what I call coral reef condition. I don't use the term reef health. I use the term condition. I think health is a loaded term. But what is the condition of the reef at the ecosystem scale? And I define that by what is the community structure, the biological community structure, what is living there, and what's the productivity. So what's the photosynthetic rate of the reef and its calcification rate. That is, how fast is the reef laying down the limestone that it forms. That's the condition. And we're getting that from the airborne imagery and models. I showed you part of that on one of the slides. What we're doing with that, that's sort of the data collection aspect. The half of the project, or a good portion of the project anyway, is analyzing all of those data across all of those reef systems against environmental parameters. And I showed you two of them. One is the aragonite saturation state, and one is the marine pollution threat, but there are a host of others. There's thermal stress, wave stress, all sorts of things that are both regionally, globally, locally, so we can analyze reef condition in the context of the environment, both natural and human sort of forced. And the idea is to understand better how reefs work, and therefore to be able to predict better how they may fare in the future. And the whole point is, and again, that those two graphs that I showed trends opposite to what we as reef scientists expect. So, and it's likely because the data we collect are at such small scales and not showing a whole ecosystem. Does that make sense? That answer your question?
Sort of. I mean, you don't have to convince me of the reason why this is important.
Right.
I totally get that. And the information that you're showing is great. I'm trying to figure out how you're getting it. It seems like you're
how
doing...
we're getting the
yes,
data.
How
Okay,
are,
sorry,
yeah.
I did skip that. We're using technology called airborne imaging spectroscopy. And this is an instrument called PRISM, the Portable Remote Imaging Spectrometer, which is built and operated by JPL. It's the latest, greatest state-of-the-art instrument for coastal imaging spectroscopy. This is, you may have heard the term hyperspectral imaging. That's what it is. It's measuring light across the near UV through the visible into the near infrared in about 200, 250 discrete wave bands, discrete channels, whereas Landsat 8 sees about 4 visible channels. PRISM sees 50 to 60 visible channels. And we're able to use that spectral information to identify what's there and to model the photosynthesis and calcification. And we're validating all of the airborne imagery with in-water activities at select locations, just to make sure that our airborne maps are accurate.
Okay, do we have any other questions from reporters in the room?
Hi, I'm Tim Olson from Earth Magazine. My question is for Ian. I was just curious about the seafloor mapping you're doing. Could you just, I guess, address what the resolution of that mapping, what resolution you're seeing with that, and presumably it's adequate resolution to see what you want to see to learn the lessons that you want to learn.
Yeah, sure. The question, there are two different resolutions because we have two different techniques for mapping the seafloor. With the ship-based component, we use primarily a multi-beam sonar. So multi-beam sonar, the multi-beam sonar we're using gives us sub-meter resolution in 5 meter pixels. And the multi-beam it's a cool instrument. It sends out a swath in a cone beneath the ship. So in one pass, it can map an area that's about 3 times the seafloor depth. For many of the fjords that we visit, we can map pretty much wall to wall of the fjord in one pass in and out. And that's really exciting, especially when you see it coming in real time. And the only real geographic limitation of the ship-based sonar is sometimes you can't get to the face of the glacier because there are too many icebergs. So courageous captains with adventurous spirits can get really close, but occasionally we have to turn around because of time. The other element, the other instrument that we use primarily on the continental shelf is an airborne gravimeter. So similar to other gravimetric instruments that you may have heard of, such as GRACE, although a slightly different principle, the airborne gravimeter measures variations of what they call free air gravitational anomaly, or free air, gravitational anomaly, and that basically helps weigh weigh the Earth's surface. And because the seafloor, because rock and sediment is denser than seawater, variations in the gravitational anomaly, variations in the gravitational field can be used to invert for the proportion of seawater to rock. And the gravimeter has a spatial resolution of about 1.5 kilometers. It's one of those instruments where the signal is so tiny that you need to average over a relatively large area to be able to get a useful measurement. So it's about 1.5 kilometer spatial resolution, and I think it's tens of meter in the vertical. So out on the continental shelf, that's perfectly sufficient. But for the fjords, you really want to go in there with a ship. And in the future, hopefully we can deploy some advanced technologies such as autonomous underwater vehicles to go in there, swim under the icebergs, and use a side scan sonar to map the rest of the way for those glaciers that just dump out so many icebergs.
Okay, do we have any other questions from reporters in the room? Do we have any questions on the chat? All right, then that concludes our workshop. So we'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you, everybody.